I've stood at the back of enough churches to know that the most beautiful part of the ceremony is also the most dishonest. We've been conditioned to look at a bride walking down the aisle and see a vision of grace, a ritual of purity, and a celebration of a new beginning. We see the lace, the silk, and especially that thin, translucent layer of tulle draped over her face, the veil, and we think of modesty. We think of the big reveal for the groom. But if you spend enough time looking through the older records, the ones kept in damp parish basements in the north of England or the early colonial journals of New England, you start to realize that the veil was never meant to be an ornament. It was a piece of tactical equipment. I remember talking to an estate liquidator in Virginia a few years back who had found a wedding trunk from the mid-1800s. Inside, tucked beneath a yellowed gown, was a veil made of heavy, intricately worked lace. It didn't feel like a fashion accessory. It felt heavy, almost claustrophobic. When I held it up to the light, I realized that from the outside, you couldn't see a single feature of the wearer's face. It wasn't designed to make the bride look mysterious. It was designed to make her disappear. We like the modern lie because the truth is uncomfortable. We've sanitized our traditions until they're nothing more than photo opportunities, but the origins of the wedding veil are rooted in a world that was much darker, much more crowded, and significantly more dangerous than the one we inhabit today. Our ancestors didn't worry about whether the flowers matched the bridesmaids' dresses. They worried about the things that stood in the corners of the room, invisible to the eye, but hungry for the vitality of a life in transition. In the ancient folklore of the British Isles, and later carried over in the superstitions of the early American settlers, a wedding wasn't just a legal or social contract. It was a liminal event, a moment where a person exists between two states of being. You are no longer a child of your father's house, but you are not yet the mistress of your husband's. You are, for a few hours, a ghost in your own life. And in that gap, that thin space between who you were and who you will become, the door is left wide open. I've spent months tracing this back through the old cunning folk traditions of the UK. They understood something we've forgotten. That joy attracts predators. A woman on her wedding day is at the peak of her earthly bloom. She is a beacon of life, fertility, and future potential. To the spirits of the dead, the jealous, the restless, and the long gone, as they were sometimes called in Appalachian folklore, that bride is an irresistible target. They don't want to bless the union. They want to steal the spark. The veil wasn't a symbol of her being untouched by men. It was a shroud to ensure she wasn't touched by the grave. If you look at the earliest iterations of this tradition, the veils weren't even white. In the Roman period, which heavily influenced early British customs, they were flammeum, a deep, blood red or startling yellow, the color of fire. The idea wasn't to look pretty, it was to trick the spirits into thinking the bride was already consumed by flame, or perhaps to mimic the appearance of a demon herself so the actual demons would leave her alone. It was camouflage. You hide the prize so the thief walks past the house. As the centuries rolled on, the colors changed, but the underlying fear remained. By the time we get to the Victorian era, the veil had become the white cloud we recognize today, but the superstition hadn't lost its teeth. I found a diary from a woman in 1840s Massachusetts who described the absolute necessity of the veil remaining down until the vows were sealed. She didn't mention modesty once. She wrote about the evil eye, a concept that most modern Americans laugh at, but which our great-great-grandmothers took as seriously as a loaded gun. The evil eye wasn't just a metaphor for jealousy. It was a literal curse, a physical weight that could be thrown by anyone, living or dead, who looked upon the bride with envy. And who is more envious than the spirits of those who died young or those who never found their own path to the altar? The church, for all its holy water and stone walls, was seen as a prime hunting ground. It was a place where the veil between worlds was already thin. Think about the structure of a traditional wedding. The bride is escorted, protected by her father, surrounded by bridesmaids. We think of bridesmaids as a support system for the bride's nerves, but historically, they were decoys. In many UK folk traditions, the bridesmaids wore dresses that were nearly identical to the brides. The goal was to create a crowd of possibilities, to confuse any malevolent entity looking to attach itself to the new wife. The veil was the final, most crucial layer of that deception. It was the mask that blurred her identity. If the spirit can't see your eyes, it can't find your soul. I've often wondered when we stopped being afraid. We've kept the costume, but we've thrown away the reason for wearing it. We've turned a survival manual into a Pinterest board. But there's a reason that even today, a bride feels a strange, cold shiver when she pulls that fabric over her face. It's a vestigial memory. It's the feeling of being hidden in plain sight while something moves through the pews behind you. When you really look at the history of the Shroud veil, you start to see the wedding ceremony differently. It's not a parade. It's a gauntlet. The bride is being moved from one secure location to another, and the veil is the smoke screen that allows her to make the crossing without being intercepted. But if the veil is a protection, what happens if it's lifted too soon? What happens if the thing you're hiding from is already inside the circle? I found a record in a 17th century Scottish court document about a wedding that took place in a village near Inverness. The bride, a young woman named Elspeth, reportedly felt the veil tugged by invisible hands the moment she stepped onto the consecrated ground of the churchyard. She insisted on keeping it pinned to her hair with iron needles, iron being a traditional defense against the fae and the restless dead. The account says she refused to lift it even for the kiss, claiming that she could see shadows with no faces standing just behind the minister, waiting for her to show herself. We dismiss these stories as superstition, a word we use to feel superior to our ancestors. But superstition is just the name we give to rituals whose original purpose we can no longer handle. We prefer the purity narrative because it's sweet. It fits the flowers. The idea that the veil is a shroud meant to ward off the hungry dead is too heavy for a modern celebration. It suggests that the world is a darker place than we want to admit, and that marriage isn't just a beginning, but a dangerous transition that requires a disguise to survive. But there is one detail I found in an old English folklore collection that changed everything for me. It wasn't just about hiding the bride from the spirits. It was about what the bride herself might see if she wasn't wearing it. They say that on your wedding day, your eyes are open to the other side. Without the veil to filter your vision, you wouldn't just be seen by the dead. You would see them. You would see the guests who weren't invited. You would see the ancestors standing in the rafters, watching to see if you're worthy of the bloodline. The veil wasn't just to keep them out. It was to keep the bride's sanity in. Because if you're standing at the altar, looking into the eyes of the person you love, the last thing you want to see is who or what is standing right behind them. And that leads me to a question that the archives don't like to answer directly. If the veil is a shield and the bridesmaids are decoys, then who is the groom actually marrying when he lifts that lace? Are we sure that the person who went under the veil is the same one who comes out from under it? The idea of a substitution, a metaphysical bait and switch, is what kept the parish records in the rural north of England so meticulously detailed for centuries. You see, the fear wasn't just that a ghost might snatch the bride away. The real terror was that something from the other side would see an empty vessel, a woman in a state of total transition, and simply step into her skin. In the eyes of ancient folklore, a woman on her wedding day is technically a ghost herself. She is leaving her father's house, leaving her name, and essentially dying to her old life to be reborn into a new family. In that liminal space, she is neither here nor there. She is vulnerable. And when you are vulnerable in a world filled with hungry, forgotten spirits, you don't wear white to be pretty. You wear white because it's the color of the bone. It's the color of the shroud. I found a series of letters from a village in the Pennines, dated back to the late 1700s, describing a veil failure. It wasn't a fashion disaster. It was a local tragedy. A young woman named Eleanor was being led to the stone church on a day when the mist was so thick you couldn't see the person walking 2 feet in front of you. Her veil, a heavy hand-spun thing that looked more like a fishing net than modern tool, got caught on a bramble bush. It tore away just as she crossed the Lich Gate, the specific entrance to the churchyard where the dead were traditionally rested before burial. The letters claim Eleanor froze. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for the lace. She just stood there, staring at the empty air while her family scrambled to cover her head. They eventually got her to the altar, they finished the vows, and they went to the feast. But the groom's sister wrote that by the time the sun went down, Eleanor's eyes had changed. She didn't recognize her own mother. She didn't know how to hold a fork. She spent the rest of her life staring at the corners of rooms, whispering in a dialect that hadn't been spoken in that valley for 3 generations. The village didn't say she had a breakdown. They said she had invited a guest home. We think we're so far removed from that kind of superstition. We live in the age of high-definition cameras and ironclad marriage licenses. But look at the Victorian era, the very people who shaped our modern American and British wedding traditions. They were obsessed with death. They were the ones who perfected the mourning veil, that heavy black crepe that shielded a widow from the world. If you place a Victorian wedding veil next to a Victorian mourning veil, the pattern is identical. The length is the same. The way it falls over the shoulders, pinning the wearer into a cage of fabric, is the same. The only difference is the color. It's a binary system. White for the woman who is dying to her maidenhood, black for the woman whose husband has died. Both are veils of protection. Both are meant to signal to the spirit world that the person underneath is currently occupied by grief or transition and should not be disturbed. There was a specific custom in the early American colonies, particularly in the isolated settlements of New England, where the veil was never bought new. It had to be weathered. Mothers would hang the bridal lace out in the graveyard for 3 nights before the ceremony. They told the young brides it was to catch the moonlight or to bless the fabric. But the older women, the ones who still remembered the stories from the old country, knew the truth. You were scenting the veil with the smell of the earth. You were making the bride smell like the dead so that the dead would think she was one of them. It was a camouflage. If a malicious spirit came looking for a vibrant young life to hijack, it would pass over the girl who smelled like the churchyard and looked like a walking corpse. This brings us to the most uncomfortable part of the ritual, the one we've turned into a romantic highlight, the lifting of the veil. In our modern mind, this is the big reveal. It's the "you may kiss the bride" moment. It's the groom finally seeing his beautiful wife. But historically, this wasn't for the groom's benefit at all. It was a test. In many UK traditions, the groom wasn't allowed to lift the veil until they were safely inside the sanctified space of the church, or sometimes not until they had crossed the threshold of their new home. The lifting was the all clear. It was the moment the community looked at her face to make sure she was still Eleanor, still Sarah, still whoever she was supposed to be. They were looking for that changed look in the eyes. If you've ever wondered why the threshold is so important, why the groom carries the bride over it, it's the same logic. The spirits are said to congregate at the entrances, the cracks between the out there and the in here. By veiling her and then physically lifting her over the gap, the groom is quite literally smuggling her past the ghosts. But what happens if the smuggler is in on it? What if the veil isn't just protecting the bride from the spirits, but protecting the groom from the bride? I came across a strange legal fragment from a 19th century court case in Massachusetts. A man was trying to annul his marriage on the grounds of supernatural fraud. He claimed that during the entire ceremony, his bride never moved her lips behind the veil. He said the voice that spoke the vows didn't come from her, but from the air around her. When he finally lifted the lace at the end of the night, he didn't see the woman he had courted for 2 years. He saw a face that was settled like cold wax, with eyes that didn't blink. The court dismissed it as a man looking for an excuse to leave a marriage he regretted. But in the local town history, the story lived on. They didn't call her a wife. They called her the veiled tenant. They said she lived in that house for 40 years, never spoke a word, and never took off the gloves. We like to think we've outgrown these shadows, We tell ourselves that the veil is just a piece of expensive mesh, a way to frame the face for the photographer. We've sanitized the terror into a tradition. But the next time you're at a wedding and you see that moment where the fabric is pulled back, watch the groom's face. Watch it closely. There is always a split second of hesitation, a tiny involuntary flicker of the eyes. We call it awe. We call it being overwhelmed by her beauty. But I think it's something else. I think it's the ancestral memory of a man checking to see who or what is looking back at him from behind the shroud. And if you look at the bride's face in that same moment, she often looks dazed, pale, like she's just woken up from a very long, very deep sleep. She's coming back from the other side. But the archives suggest that sometimes the person who comes back isn't the one who left. And that is where the real story begins. Because the veil doesn't just hide you from the dead, it provides a perfect cover for the dead to hide in you. I started looking into the early colonial records in New England and the rural counties of England during the 18th century. There was a specific term that kept popping up in death ledgers and marriage bans: the covering. It wasn't a fashion choice. In those days, a wedding wasn't just a union. It was a transition through a high-risk spiritual zone. The bride was considered liminal, stuck between her father's house and her husband's, belonging to neither, and therefore vulnerable to the hollow folk. There's a reason the veil was historically long, often touching the floor. It wasn't for the aesthetic of a long train. It was meant to create a physical circle of protection, a literal barrier between the bride's skin and the cold air of the church. Churches, especially the old stone ones in the UK, weren't just houses of worship. They were graveyards. You walked over the dead to get to the altar. The veil was the suit of armor. And then there's the color. We're told Queen Victoria started the white wedding trend, and that's the neat corporate answer we give to tourists. But if you dig into the folklore of the Scottish Highlands or the Appalachian Hills, white wasn't for purity. White was the color of the shroud. It was the color of the ghost. By dressing the bride in the colors of the dead, you were playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. If the spirits looking for a fresh soul saw someone who already looked like a corpse, they'd move on. The bride wasn't being celebrated. She was being camouflaged. I found a diary from a woman in 1840s Vermont. She wrote about her wedding day with a chilling lack of joy. She described the veil as the heavy mist that smelled of old trunks and damp earth. She wrote that once it was pinned to her hair, she felt her own name slipping away. This is the part of the tradition we don't talk about in bridal magazines. The veil represents the death of the individual. In the eyes of the old law, the woman died the moment she stepped toward the altar, only to be reborn as a different legal entity under her husband. The veil was the funeral wrapping for the girl she used to be. But the archives suggest that sometimes the spirits weren't fooled by the camouflage. They saw the gap. There are dozens of accounts from the late Victorian era of the wrong bride. Stories of men who lifted the veil only to find a woman who looked like their beloved, but whose shadow didn't match her movements. Or women who, after the ceremony, realized they couldn't remember anything between the moment the veil lowered and the moment it was raised. They were absent. Think about the bridesmaids. We think they're there to hold the flowers. But the original purpose was even more pragmatic. They were decoys. They dressed similarly to confuse the spirits, to dilute the target. But only the bride wore the face covering. She was the one at the center of the ritual, the one standing directly over the threshold. We still use that word, threshold. We forget it means the place where the grain is thrashed, where the shell is broken to get to the seed. It makes you wonder about the lifting ceremony itself. In modern weddings, it's the climax of the ceremony, the big reveal. But in the older, darker versions of the ritual, it was the moment of greatest danger. It was the moment the protection was removed. If the timing was off, if the words hadn't been said exactly right, or the sun had already dipped below the horizon, the lifting of the veil was an invitation. You were opening a window in a storm. I think about this every time I see a wedding invitation. We're being invited to witness a ritual that has been stripped of its warning labels. We see the lace, the silk, the delicate embroidery, and we see romance. But the fabric is heavy with the weight of 5,000 years of fear. We've turned a survival tactic into a photo op. We've forgotten that the veil was never meant to make the bride look beautiful to the groom. It was meant to make her invisible to the things that go bump in the night. We've kept the costume, but we've lost the script. Maybe that's why some people feel an inexplicable chill in a church during a ceremony. It's not the air conditioning. It's the collective memory of a time when the stakes were life and death. The file on the wedding veil isn't about fashion. It's about the lengths we go to trick the universe into letting us be happy. So if you're planning a wedding or attending one this year, pay attention to the fabric. Notice how it mutes the light. Notice how it separates the woman from the world. And when the groom reaches up to pull it back, notice if his hands shake. He's not just nervous about the kiss. He's participating in an ancient gamble. He's hoping that when the shroud is lifted, the person he finds underneath is the one he remembers. But as the old records show, the veil is a one-way door. And once it's been opened, you can never really be sure what came through with her. That's the end.